So, for starters, does anybody know what the #1 cause of plane crashes is in the United States?
Pilot air?
Well, besides pilot air.
Oh.
It goes pilot air. That's the first thing you would blurt out. Of course, pilot air does go into this, but the actual issue. You're on the right track. What specific thing causes almost all general aviation plane crashes in the country? No. Well, what are we talking about today?
Fuel.
Right, so
No fuel?
fuel starvation.
Okay.
Fuel starvation, for some reason or another, is what causes most plane crashes in the United States. So it's important, obviously, because we all want to live and self-preserve and not kill ourselves. We're the first ones to die because we're the first ones to hit the ground. So knowing about this actually is important, because if you don't know how the fuel system works and everything, like if you don't know what the mixture actually does, if you don't know what the fuel selector actually does, if you don't know what happens when the engine doesn't have enough fuel, then how can you actually counteract like an emergency when it does happen? You know? So first of all, so what we're gonna do today is talk about I'm a fuel molecule. How do I get from the fuel truck to the exhaust gases that come out of the plane? So first of all, who could tell me what type of fuel we use in our plane?
Blue 100 low lead.
Yes. Are there any other types that we can use in our plane?
You use 100 leaded, the green stuff.
Exactly, yeah, but they don't really, it's not that they don't make it.
Yeah, if you can find
kind
it,
of
you can
uncommon.
use it.
Yeah, and they only have 100 low lead at Jet A and Jet A Plus, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100 green.
Yeah, so, all right, so the fuel comes from the fuel truck, obviously. We know where it goes in, we know where the fuel tanks are, they're in the wings. You've seen this at least by now, right? Checking the fuel?
Yeah.
So that's where you check the fuel. Does anybody know the little tab inside the fuel tank? Does anybody know what that little metal tab actually means, or what it symbolizes, or what it
17
quantifies?
Gallons. 17 gallons, is it?
Mm-hmm. You know what that means, though?
Oh.
What's significant about 17 gallons?
Low.
Well, yeah. It's the most fuel that we can carry in each tank if we're going to operate in the utility category.
Gotcha.
Which we don't do because we're not aerobatic. But anyway, so let's pull this up. This is the first thing here. So now we're just going to start with, I guess, so the fuel's in the fuel tank. Do you might know why we sump? Why is there a little spigot on the bottom that we get fuel out of?
Shake for water and stuff that's in the fuel?
Water, debris, that sort of thing. Do you might know why that's important, or why we do that in the first place, or why it would be bad if we had water or
Because
debris?
the plane engine can't run on water.
Yeah. And debris, you can,
Insightful.
yeah.
Wait, is that how this-
Water doesn't burn. So,
That's why this is expensive.
Straightforward question.
yeah. So, and contaminants can, break our fuel pumps. They can, so what I'll get into later is that our fuel air mixture is actually gaseous. So if we have solid particles in that gaseous mixture, that could obviously be detrimental. Cool, so it leaves the fuel tank. And okay, so first of all, here's our little diagram. This is straight out of the POH, chapter 7. So there's the right, so this is oriented as if these are the pilot seats, right here, left and right, essentially, right? This is the right tank and the right wing, the left tank and the left wing. This will be the nose, the tip of the nose over here. So what controls where the fuel comes from is the fuel selector, obviously. We have off, right, and left. Cessnas have both. They're kind of lucky, so they don't ever have to switch back and forth like we do. But so the first place that it passes when it leaves either of the fuel tank, whichever one you have it set to, is the fuel selector valve itself, which isn't the actual knob we have. That's just for convenience for us. That obviously there's a system of, I guess, rods and mechanical linkages that actually open and close these valves. So it lets fuel either flow from one or the other. Next place it goes, and also it's worth saying, I guess, that there's sensors on the sides of the tanks that go to our fuel quantity gauges. And then, so after it passes to the fuel selector, it goes to the fuel strainer, which is this little thing right here. Y'all all see this, by the way, pretty well?
Yep.
Okay. So the strainer obviously does what it says it does. It strains the fuel, and it does its best to get any contaminants or water out. Some fuel does go into it. So does anybody know why that's significant to us during our pre-flight, or what we have to do with that during our pre-flight? The strainer and the reservoir where the excess would cooled up.
That will show us we got the right fuel in it and that we don't have any of those debris or contaminant.
Yeah, I guess I didn't ask the question very good, I guess. What I was getting at is that, you know, we have our sumps under the wings, and there's one more on the front, on the side of the cowling. So when we sump that third one on the front, like we're sumping whatever fuel and any contaminants that got into it from the front. And usually there's not any in there. But that would be a good indication of whether on the last flight, while the system was running, if it was extracting like contaminants in water. So anyway, so that's the next step. Then it goes through the electric fuel pump. Whether it's on or off, it does not matter. As you can see, this little line here is the primer, so that's kind of separate. There's no other way to get around the electric fuel pump to go through the engine-driven fuel pump. So if it's on, it's pumping. If it's off, it's not. Either way, it still flows through it. So the electric comes first, then the engine-driven. But does anybody know why are there two? Just for starters, why do we have an engine-driven and electric fuel pump?
Just for our initial start, we don't have any rotation going to power a mechanical-driven fuel pump to build any pressure.
Right, that's one. Because without the engine-driven fuel pump isn't being driven because it's not on. What would be like the second reason, which is a little more, it's redundancy. If one of them breaks, the other one will still be there. Or, you know, if we have, never mind. If one of them breaks, the other one will still be there. So that's the first place it goes. I'll cut off here a little bit to talk about the primer. So we have the little primer button up there, and that essentially all it does is like there's fuel in this line, right? And it sprays vaporized fuel into 3 of the cylinders. So like if you follow this line from like here, it goes up and into that one, and then around here and into these 2. So does anybody know why it would only spray into 3 of them and not all 4 of them? No? Okay, so basically if you do too much, if you prime too much, you can flood the engine. You can flood the cylinders and spray too much. So it only does 3. That way, there's still a 4th one that can still get a spark if you flooded the other 3. If you just flooded all 4, your engine wouldn't start. You'd have to follow whatever procedures to unflood it, basically. So that's why it only does 3 of them. Yeah.
I heard one more thing too about that, is that since it's a Lycoming 360 horizontally opposed engine, it's the same one that we use in the Seminole. And the 3rd cylinder is where they have the manifold pressure gauge sensor. And so that's another reason why we don't have it, is because these engines are used in the Seminole, and so that would be where the manifold pressure gauge goes.
Right, if we have one in this, yeah, like in the Seminole. Interesting, I never heard that before. And I didn't realize that the engines between the Seminole and the Archer were that similar.
They're the exact
I would
same.
have thought they would have been a little different, I guess, but
Yeah.
interesting. I haven't learned anything about Seminole yet, but cool. So we use the primer when the engine's cold. What that does is like sometimes it's just the fuel air mixture and everything is just too cold to actually like ignite. So spraying that raw fuel in there like that just helps it to get a little boost. Frank, our maintenance guy at LZU, one time told me, do everything you can not to use the primer. It's really bad for the cylinders. It can cause, you know, pre-ignition and carbon buildup, and it's just bad for it. So even if it's cold, you know, couple pumps on the throttle, try to start it. You can hold it down for, you know, up to like 8 seconds, I think, and then, you know, if it doesn't work, try it again, and then maybe after that time, then you can use the primer. That's coming straight from Frank. That was his suggestions to me.
Also, David will sometimes pump it 3 times.
Yeah, 3. Frank even said like pump it like 3, 4, 5 times. It doesn't really matter. I mean, don't go crazy with it doing it 15 times, but you know. Anyway, so. All right, so that's kind of the primer. So that just kind of leads off in a separate little system on its own. So electric fuel pump, and we know we use the electric fuel pump for takeoffs, landings, pattern, climb, descents, critical phases of flight in case our engine-driven dies. Because the thing is, if our engine-driven fuel pump died, you wouldn't immediately know that it died. It would take a few seconds for the rest of the fuel air mixture to leave the lines and then burn off, and then the engine would just die. And then the first thing you think of might not be, oh, turn the fuel pump on. You know, like you're hopefully not freaking out, but you know what I mean. If the first time in an emergency the engine dies, like, you know, you might be having some panic, you know. So that's why we just keep it on this critical phase, is just in case. And then, okay, so it goes to the electric fuel pump. Then the engine driven, so it does pass through both either way. The engine driven, as long as the engine's running, should always be on if it's working. Yeah. So it goes through both of those, and then it passes up here into the carburetor. So that's the first phase of our lesson, is that's kind of the actual fuel system itself. So, oh, and actually, yeah, so our fuel pressure gauge, so you see it's kind of, this little black line is right here. So that's where the actual gauge is, the measurement, because we care about fuel pressure right before it gets to the carburetor. If it was here, well, it could lose pressure, the engine fuel, it could lose pressure as it keeps going. So we want to make sure there's pressure right before it goes into the carburetor, because that's where it matters the most. So that's where that's located. So on that note, for now, does anybody have questions at this point? Does anything not make sense, or just way over your head, or am I doing an okay job? Yes?
Just for the Cessna, fuel is just pulled evenly from their tanks?
Yeah, from what I know.
It's just, we switch them?
Yeah, from what I know, for starters, high wing, so Cessna's in a high wing and we're in a low wing. So our fuel system our engine is above our fuel tanks. So that's why we need pumps to pump it out. Cessna's, because they're high wing, the fuel tanks are actually above the engine. So for it to get down into the engine, it's just gravity fed. So they don't actually even have fuel pumps. I don't think, well, maybe they do just in case, maybe an emergency backup. Do you know anything about that?
I think they do. I haven't flown one in a while. I'm pretty sure they have pumps.
They might have one just for
But yeah, they have a dual
case
feed. You can feed it off one or the other, but it is like you're saying, it's just a true feed rather than
it's great.
Suction it through.
Right, it's gravity fed. Because so if you look at a Cessna, which I wish I had a little model or something, but there's those kind of pipe looking things that come from the wings down to the body. That is actually the pathway that the fuel flows down. I think, I'm pretty sure. Again, I don't know a lot about Cessnas, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
All right, so that's that. And then, so once it goes into the carburetor, we are going to switch gears to this little diagram here. So we have a float type carburetor, which is that, essentially. It might not look exactly like that, but that's the best diagram you're gonna get. This is a carburetor, which I actually think this might be a car carburetor. I'm not actually sure exactly what this is supposed to go in. It doesn't really look a whole lot like that, but if y'all want to pass that around, this little lever right here actually controls this is the throttle. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but it actually opens and closes the throttle. So once I do talk about it, y'all can kind of get a more, I guess, hands-on feeling of how that actually looks. All right, so fuel comes into, after it leaves the lines that fed into the carburetor, it comes in through this little spout here, and it goes into this reservoir. This little ball, I believe it's just made out of rubber. It's just a floating ball. All that does is just regulate the amount of fuel in here, so it doesn't just back up and just go way out. Yeah, so it regulates how much fuel is allowed to be in this little reservoir. So let's see, where do I want to go with this next? So, okay. On the front of the plane, there's you have the propeller, and you have those two holes right next to the propeller. So that's where the air comes in to cool the engine. And we have that third little slot, so propeller, holes, there's that third little rectangular looking slot down here that kind of goes in deep down there. It's part of the thing you're supposed to check to make sure there's no bird's nest or anything in there. So that actually is the intake for the carburetor. That's where the air comes in for the carburetor. So the air comes in through that and it gets fed into the carburetor through, these little blue arrows are it coming in. So Bernoulli's principle is that, as the velocity of a fluid increases, the pressure within that fluid decreases, and that's how we get lift. Well, Bernoulli's principle also works in the second place in our plane, not just the wings, and the carburetor. So, and in fact, the person Bernoulli, who discovered the principle, he was using what's called a Venturi throat. He didn't do it looking at airplane wings, he looked at it because he was letting water pass through a restricted tube, basically. So that's what this is. So the air comes in, and there's this little throat right here. So it gets narrower. How's it going? So it gets narrower, so the air is forced to pass through that narrow opening. So it speeds up, and when it speeds up, pressure decreases. So what actually gets the fuel out of this reservoir into this passageway is that pressure differential. So the fact that the pressure is lower right here and higher right here, we know that fluids want to move from high to low. High temperature to low temperature, high pressure to low pressure. That's why then we have lots of different things with weather. Lots of things want to move from high to low. So it moves through this little blue kind of narrow little tube right here. And it's literally just sucked out by that pressure differential. So this little pin is actually called the mixture needle. So when we move our little mixture lever, the orange knob, up and down, it's not just a pretty little knob that does something cool. It actually opens and closes like it moves up and down and widens or narrows like a little outlet right here. And so that literally is controlling how much fuel you allow to leave this little chamber to mix with the air. And so, we have our leaning procedures, and as we increase our altitude, I know you're really, early on, you might not know all this yet, but as we increase our altitude, air becomes less dense. So with air becoming less dense and with less pressure, for any given volume of air, there's less air molecules. So as we go up to 12,000 feet, which we don't go that high, but 12,000 feet, there's going to be significantly less air molecules coming through this passageway as it comes into the plane. So because of that, we want to keep our fuel-air ratio where it's supposed to be. So if we leave that mixture full rich as we're climbing, it's just going to keep letting the same amount of fuel out that it's been doing the whole time, while the air is diminishing little until we just keep going. So that's why we lean with altitude, and we lean with certain phases of flight. Like taxi, we want to have it lean, but then in the run up, we don't want to have it too lean. We want to have it rich enough. So it's all a specific ratio that we're looking for. And in our planes, we kind of have to guess. The G1000 Archers have like an exhaust gas temperature gauge, which the sim does too, if you've ever looked at that little needle. And that can help you know exactly where you need to lean or enrich to, based on the temperature of the exhaust gas. We don't have that. We're not fortunate enough in our planes to know exactly, so we're just it's a guessing game. Like you lean it till you hear it cough, and then you kick it back up a little bit, Anyway, so that's how you control how much fuel is mixed in with the air. So it leaves this, it goes down this tunnel here. This tiny little white line, if y'all can see that, is actually called the air bleed. So what that does is it kind of infuses this fuel right here with air bubbles, okay? And so that's gonna help with the vaporization of the fuel. So, and as I said earlier, y'all remember me saying this, that the fuel-air mixture is gaseous. So there's not liquid fuel going into the combustion cycle at all, because that just wouldn't really work. It has to be a gaseous fuel-air mixture. And also it's worth saying that it needs to be a fuel-air mixture, because if it was just straight fuel, it's just too combustible, it's too flammable, it would just explode. So we have to basically water it down, or air it down, I guess you could say, with air. This is a lot of information, so but the ideal ratio with full rich is like 1 to 9. So 1 part fuel for 9 parts air, and then full lean is like 1 to 18. So 1 part fuel to 18 parts air. So like in a fuel air ratio, if you're like just between rich and lean, you're like 1 to 14 or something like that. So that's 1 part fuel for 14 parts air. So 1/14 of that mixture is actually fuel, the rest of it's air. So we're not actually using that much fuel in this ratio, I guess you could say. Anyway, so some air gets infused in with the fuel right here so that it helps with the vaporization. So when it comes out of these little outlets right here, which is called the discharge nozzle, is this little thing right here, it sprays the fuel out in tiny particles, which just helps it vaporize. And when you think vaporization, you might think like water evaporating with heat. Well, if we heat up fuel, it's going to blow up. So it actually uses pressure. So the fact that the pressure right here is lower, fuel, when subjected to lower pressure, wants to vaporize. I don't know all the physics behind that, but it does. So when you spray it out in very tiny particles, and it's already been infused with the air bubbles, and then there's this low pressure, it just turns into vapor. So it's gaseous instead of liquid at that point. That's about all you need to know about that. You could get way more in depth than that. I'm not going to. So at that point, though, so you can see these tiny little bubbles here. Essentially, that's the fuel being vaporized, and there's always air kind of moving through this. So at this point right here, you've got your fuel-air mixture essentially made. So then the next kind of step, I guess. So this little disc right here is what you guys were kind of playing with the carburetor. So this is the throttle. Now, I know the little lever we have is also called the throttle, but that's actually the throttle. We just have a throttle lever, I guess you could say. So what that actually does is it opens and closes this just like what y'all saw. When it's flat, you know, it's closed, and when it's vertical, it's fully open. So when fully open, it lets all the fuel air mixture that's in here leave. There's no restriction to that flow. And as you pull the throttle back, it slowly closes and closes and closes, and clearly it's restricting it more and more and letting less of it leave. Now when it's fully closed, it's not actually completely closed, it's sealed. If that was the case, your engine would just shut off. And as we know, when you pull the throttle all the way back, it doesn't just shut down, you just idle. Because there's still, it's not sealed, there's cracks, and it's still open just a little bit. But we use the mixture knob to shut the engine down, because that's actually completely cutting off all the fuel. So then, that's why when you pull the mixture knob back, it still takes a few seconds to actually shut down, because there's still a fuel air mixture all through the lines and in the cylinders until it actually combustion stops happening, because it doesn't just burn the air, it needs fuel. So anyway, so then after that, it leaves the carburetor and goes into the cylinders. So that, in a nutshell right there, is exactly the process of when it comes into the carburetor until it goes on its way, gets vaporized, and the fuel air mixture leaves it. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah. That's 20 minutes for you too, right there.
Cool. Everybody good on that so far? Does that all make sense?
It's great.
Cool. Did I brush over anything? I know I got a little in depth there with some of that with the vaporization and whatnot, but
That was good.
I know it's a lot of information. But anyway, all right. So that's pretty much it.